All right, so this is video number 2 of action planning. What we just did was talk about SMART objectives, where we made our objectives more specific, more measurable, more achievable, more relevant, and more time-based. And we gave you some examples of how we can do that in a specific objective. So the objective, the example that we created in our SMART objectives section was about providing a health education curriculum to students. In order to do that, we were going to train staff and volunteers in this curriculum. And we came up with a very smart curriculum. That's a very smart objective explaining this process, okay? So our second step here is brainstorming activities related to this objective. Once we have our objective, you can see it here on the left, by September 15th, 2018, we want to provide all project staff and volunteer leaders with a 1-hour Eat Well, Be Well curriculum training, followed by a post-test in which all participants score at least 90% correct answers. So that's our objective here. So what we want to do now is give you some time to brainstorm. It's really helpful if you have a team of people here, not just one person, because that way you can get multiple perspectives on this. So if we have people who are at the boots on the ground level, they're going to have specific activities that they think of, specific actions that come to mind for them that are different than someone who might be at a leadership level. The leadership level person might be thinking more in terms of strategy. Both of those perspectives are really important. So what we will have you do is, at this point, work on creating this list. So what would you need to do to achieve this specific objective? You'll write each, we're in this case using just separate sticky notes. So you would write each activity on a separate sticky note, or you can type it into a Word document or into a spreadsheet, but keeping them as separate ideas. Don't organize anything yet. That step comes later. Just write down as many ideas as you can, okay? You can use 3 minutes to do this practice with your group. Just pause the video, and then once you've had about 3 minutes, you'll come back and we'll move on to the next steps, okay? Again, don't organize yet. Just brainstorm. What would you need to do across as many different levels as you can think of in order to achieve this objective? Ready? Go. Okay, now we're back. You guys have all hopefully paused the video and taken an opportunity to write down a whole bunch of different activities. So again, in the top right, we have our specific objective up here, what we're trying to achieve. In terms of trying to create this training program, there are a lot of different things we have to do. So we've brainstormed a few of them here. There are lots of others that are not listed on this page yet. So identifying project staff and the volunteer leaders that should participate in this is one component. You may find out in that process that you don't have enough volunteers, so you might need to recruit more volunteers and more volunteer leaders. Our event preparation team said, oh wait, one of the things that we need to make sure we do is that we stuff folders with the handouts so that that's all ready to go. People who are thinking in terms of what this needs to look like logistically from start to finish will think, oh wait, who's going to be responsible for this? Who's going to lead this training component? Or we could step back even further from that. What curriculum are we going to use? If in this case we're saying we have our Eat Well, Be Well curriculum, if we hadn't defined that already, we would need to have a very important activity of identifying that curriculum. So you can go through all of these different components. One thing that we didn't have listed up here is this idea of a post-test. So we would have to have activities related to creating a post-test or finding a post-test that we can adapt. What type of format are we going to use? Is it going to be paper pencil? Is it going to be something that we use Google Forms for? Do we have a survey system that we would want to use? What does that all look like? So we've got everything from the basic beginning steps in conceptualizing what this would look like all the way through to what happens in planning the event and following up after the event. All of those can go on this activities list. So after we have a pretty solid list of activities, of the kinds of things we would need to do to support our objective, our next step is to organize this. After we've done our brainstorming, you have all those activities written down, put them into order. So in this case, it's easier if you use something like sticky notes or if you have it in a digital format because you can drag and drop. You can move your sticky notes around on the wall. So at this point, the first thing that we want to do is group things in terms of themes and categories. So some of your activities might be really minute detail. How can you combine some of those together to create some themes or categories? So maybe we have one around volunteers, and there are specific activities we need to do around volunteers. We might have a category around this post-test, and there are specific activities that we move under that category related to that post-test. So that's the first step that we would do. We put them into categories. Now within those categories, at this point, you're going to now put them in chronological order under that category. So once we're done with this, we will have different categories, different themes, where we've grouped different activities under those categories. And then within each category, we've walked through and put them in some sort of chronological order. In some cases, you might have multiple activities that have to happen simultaneously, and that's okay. You can put them next to each other, you can do whatever you want. In some way, you can represent that these activities need to come at the same time. But overall, we now have them in categories, and we have them in chronological order. So once you've done that, you're going to review this list. And what you'll start to notice is that when you take that step back, and you start looking at your organized list at this point, you're going to start to see the gaps. So you may identify that there are entire categories that you haven't even thought about yet, and you need to add some categories. You may decide that within the smaller actions under a specific category, again, there are major gaps that you need to deal with. So you start to, as you review the list, add in what needs to be added in terms of more categories for activities and more specific activities. These activities, in terms of planning for a proposal, they can be pretty big picture activities. It doesn't need to be printing handout 1 as activity 1 and printing handout 2 as activity number 2. It could be prepare handouts and agendas and whatever other documents you need for the presentation. Those could all be one activity in the case of this type of action planning. If you want to get really granular, you can do that. In terms of putting it into a proposal, though, you want these activities to be pretty big picture so that people can see what you're doing, but not get lost in all the details. So once you've done all that, you've reviewed your list, you've added more things, or removed things, or combined things, then you review it again, make sure you're not missing anything else, bring in some other people, make sure that other eyes see it, that they can give you feedback, and that you've made this a pretty comprehensive list, okay? After we've got this list of activities where we feel like we don't have major gaps left, our next steps will be moving on to assigning responsibility and then looking at time and managing time for each of these.